Got it. All right, there we go. So we're all set. As I mentioned, my name is Alexia, a policy manager at Plug in America. Waiting in the wings to help support us during the Q&A section is also Jay Friedland, who is a senior policy advisor for Plug in America and a longtime industry expert. So you'll see him later on when we get to the Q&A section. So our agenda for today is pretty simple. We're going to be focusing on the consumer-focused EV provisions from the Inflation Reduction Act. We'll start with a little background on the IRA. We'll then talk quite a lot about the new EV tax credit, as well as the used EV tax credit. We'll also provide you a little bit of information on the EV charger credit. And then how we are packaging all of this information in order to help you make your vehicle purchasing decisions. Then at the end, we'll go through a quite thorough question and answer period. So if you do have questions that come up during the session, please feel free to submit them via the question and answer box. Our team will collect those and we'll answer them at the end. Thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing all of your thoughts. So just to go ahead and get started here, the Inflation Reduction Act was signed into law by President Biden on August 16, 2022. It features a package of climate and energy provisions, a whole package, not just EV provisions, but the EV provisions are extensive, and they include consumer credits for new and used vehicles, which we'll be talking about today, alternative refueling stations credit, which is a fancy way of saying it's a charging infrastructure credit, so a credit to help you pay for charging stations, commercial and manufacturing credits to help get that ramped up on the commercial side, and then additional EV support like assistance for the USPS on helping to electrify their fleets. So right into, I think, the thing that everyone's most interested in today, the EV tax credit for new vehicles. So we'll actually start by talking a little bit about the previous EV tax credit, so we understand that base point. So the previous EV tax credit provided up to $7,500 for the purchase of an electric vehicle. Each manufacturer can only sell up to 200,000 eligible vehicles under the previous credit. The credit can also only be claimed on a consumer's taxes for that year. Now that the IRA is law as of August 16th, 2022, the previous credit no longer applies in the same way. We'll be talking about this extensively later on, how it applies, what means what for 2022 and beyond. So the new EV tax credit is now called the Clean Vehicle Credit. And this is because it includes plug-in electric vehicles and fuel cell vehicles. The $7,500 credit, so it's still $7,500, is now split into two equal parts, which each have different eligibility requirements. The first part is the critical minerals piece, which is $3,750. And then the second part is the battery components piece, which is $3,750 as well. So vehicles must meet overall eligibility requirements to receive either half or both halves of the credit. And those overall requirements include things like the Msrp caps, which we'll be discussing, final assembly provision, as well as income caps. And don't worry about noting any of this. We'll be discussing it further in detail as we go, and everything will be available for your review afterwards. The new credit as well also eliminates the manufacturer cap. So that cap I mentioned before, that will no longer apply. It applies to new purchase, financed, and leased vehicles, and it also is only allowed one credit per vehicle. One thing to note is that 2- and 3-wheel vehicles are not eligible under this credit. So for vehicle eligibility, this is the tricky piece that I mentioned. So on the first half, the critical minerals half, if vehicles meet the following provision, they are eligible for one half of the $7,500 credit. In order to meet this provision, vehicles must have a minimum percentage of critical minerals that were extracted or processed in the US or our free trade partner countries, or recycled in North America. And that would include things like lithium, graphite, nickel, cobalt, all the important materials for electric vehicles. And so in order to meet this credit, like I said, these things must be extracted or processed in the US or our free trade partner countries or recycled in North America. And that's how you would receive one half of the credit for your vehicle. In order to receive the other half of the credit, vehicles are eligible if they meet a minimum percentage of battery components that have been manufactured or assembled in North America. So you can think of this like a made in America provision. That means as long as the pieces come from from America, excuse me, as long as the pieces come from North America, then the vehicle should be eligible for this half of the credit. So putting 2 and 2 together, the battery components and the critical minerals pieces total to that $7,500 credit. In order to get either half of the credit, vehicles must also meet the following restrictions. Eligible vehicles must fall at or below the following Msrp caps. So that's $80,000 for vans, SUVs, and pickup trucks, and $55,000 for other vehicles, which includes your average sedan and other light duty passenger vehicles. Additionally, vehicles to be eligible for either half of the credit must have final assembly in North America, and no parts of the supply chain value will be allowed to come from what we call foreign entities of concern, which include countries like China and Russia. Additionally, on the consumer side, eligible consumers must fall at or below the following income caps: $300,000 for joint filers, $225,000 for head of household, and $150,000 for single filers. So that's definitely something to keep in mind because it's a big change from the previous credit. Additionally, and this is something that's very exciting, is that there will be a point of purchase option available. So consumers will be allowed to transfer the credit to a registered dealer to apply the credit at point of purchase, which would allow money to be taken off the hood of the vehicle. One thing to note is that this option will not be allowed until 2024, but definitely good to keep in mind as you're planning out your vehicle purchasing decisions. So to sum all of that up, I know it was quite a lot. Here's what we think is a helpful chart to help you think through some of this criteria. So as you can see from this, in order to be eligible for either half of the credit, vehicles must meet what's in the overall criteria column. In order to be eligible for each half of the credit, they must additionally meet what's in the sourcing criteria column, all of which can total to $7,500. Of course, as I mentioned, these slides will be available afterwards, so you can definitely feel free to use this at your leisure later on. So in terms of the transition period, I know we've gotten quite a lot of questions about that because I think that's where most of the confusion is coming from. This is what we know so far through 2022. So through the rest of 2022, through the rest of this year, the previous $7,500 EV tax credit is still available. There are some caveats. The final assembly provision that I mentioned applies as of August 16th, 2022. So vehicles now must have final assembly in North America to be eligible for the current credit. And this is what I was referring to earlier as the previous credit. This is the credit we've been used to for the past few years, with the additional provision that final assembly must now be in North America. Additionally, as a note, the manufacturer cap is still active. That means Tesla and GM are not eligible, and Toyota is expected to begin its phase out on October 1st, 2022. So that's all to say that through the rest of 2022, Tesla and GM vehicles are still ineligible for the credit, so not eligible. Additionally, Msrp caps and income caps do not apply yet, as well as the battery components and critical minerals provisions also do not apply yet. So it's really the tax credit that we've been used to with the added final assembly provision. And that's for the rest of this year through 2022. So for beyond 2022, starting in 2023, that's when the new tax credit will be available for all manufacturers and eligible vehicles and consumers through 2032, giving us a nice cushion time there. Battery components and the critical minerals provisions will apply at that point, as will the MSRP and income caps. The final assembly provision will also still apply. And one thing to note is that the used EV tax credit will also be available for eligible vehicles and consumers. And we'll be talking about the used EV credit here in just a moment. So just so that you can get a visual on what that all looks like, we have here pre-August 2022, we have here in 2022, we had the previous EV tax credit was available. This included the manufacturer cap. GM and Tesla are not eligible. Toyota is only eligible for the partial credit. Upon signing, when the IRA became law on August 16th, 2022, the previous 7,500 EV tax credit is still available, but now includes the final assembly provision. As I mentioned, it still includes the manufacturer cap as well. In 2023, the new EV tax credit will replace the previous EV tax credit. So this is when the critical minerals, the battery components, and final assembly provisions will apply, as well as the MSRP caps and the income caps. The manufacturer cap will be eliminated at this point. So this is when Tesla and GM may be eligible again for the tax credit. Starting in 2024, we'll be able to use that point of purchase option. So the transfer of credit will now be available. The credit would be able to be transferred to any dealer to apply at the point of sale. Additionally, in 2024, the ban on foreign entities of concern, so that's where I mentioned countries like Russia and China, for the battery components go into effect. In 2025, that's when the ban on the foreign entities of concern goes into effect for the critical minerals piece. And then in 2032, that's when the credit expires. So like I said, this will be available for your reference later on. So on the EV tax credit for used vehicles, this is a lot more straightforward and also extremely exciting, as this is the first time that we've seen any sort of federal incentive for used vehicles, and really can help us to open up the market in the US, given that 2/3 of Americans tend to buy used vehicles. So this is an absolutely unprecedented tax credit for used vehicles. It provides either $4,000 or 30% of the sale price of the eligible used vehicle, whichever is smaller. The used tax credit will be available in 2023, so starting next year. And the point of purchase option, so taking money off the hood, will be allowed after 2023, so starting in 2024. Eligible consumers also must fall at or below outlined income caps. These will be different than the income caps for the new vehicle credit. And vehicles must also meet additional price and sale requirements. So we'll be talking about that here on the next slide. So as you can see, there are a set of vehicle requirements, there's income caps, and then there's the final credit amount. So on the vehicle requirements, the vehicle, in order to be eligible for the used EV tax credit, must be at least 2 years old, under $25,000, sold by a dealer. The nice thing about this used EV tax credit is that there are no additional sourcing requirements. So all of those things I mentioned earlier on the critical minerals, battery components, final assembly, none of that applies to the used EV tax credit. What does apply is the income caps that have been set for the used EV tax credit. Similarly to the new credit, there are income caps for the used credit. So the income caps for the used credit, as you can see from this slide, are $150,000 for a joint return, $112,500 for head of household, and $75,000 for others, which would also include single filers. And as I mentioned, the credit amount is either $4,000 or 30% of the vehicle price, whichever is smaller. So moving right along to the infrastructure side, the Inflation Reduction Act also extends the current EV charger credit and makes some amendments to it. So the EV charger credit has been extended through 2032. It can be used by individuals or by commercial businesses. For individuals, the tax credit covers up to 30% covers 30% or up to $1,000 per unit of the cost of the equipment. And on the commercial side, the tax credit covers 6% or up to $100,000 per unit of the cost of the equipment. Additionally, bidirectional charging equipment is eligible, and 2- and 3-wheeled equipment is eligible as well. So this would include infrastructure for bikes or other 3-wheeled vehicles. Starting after 2022, equipment must be placed in a low-income community or non-urban area. This is something that we want to highlight because if you're interested in installing a charger in your home, this is something important to remember. If you do not live in one of those areas, you will not be eligible for the charger credit. So moving right along here to the section I think we're all probably most excited about is making vehicle purchasing decisions. So how can we do that when the credits are all complicated and we might not know what vehicles are eligible and when? So some tips from us is that confirmed information on eligible vehicles for the new credit is not yet available. If you're planning purchasing decisions, the manufacturer is actually the best source of information. For some of these things, like the critical minerals components and the battery components, the manufacturer is likely the only one that knows where those things are coming from and the vehicle eligibility. And manufacturers are racing to meet these new requirements. Eligibility will likely change rapidly for each vehicle. So we definitely recommend to keep checking because 1 year to the next, a vehicle that was ineligible might then become eligible as a manufacturer starts to meet those new requirements. Another thing to note, given the new MSRP caps for the credit, is to be sure to configure your vehicle order to fall under those MSRP caps so that it can be eligible. Additionally, as I mentioned, consider purchasing a charger for your home this year to ensure you can use the EV charger credit. That's a really helpful credit that helps you to charge even more quickly at your home. Additionally, we've outlined some resources that we believe will be really helpful as you make this purchasing decision. Please visit these following links to help you make the decision. The IRS has created a breakdown of the credit and the transition period rules if you'd like further information from them. There's a list of vehicles with final assembly in North America that the Department of Energy has put together. And there's also what they call a VIN decoder. So the VIN, Vehicle Identification Number decoder for build location information from the Department of Energy. And this can help you to identify on a specific individual vehicle level if your vehicle has been built in North America and if it meets that final assembly provision. Something I'll also point you to is Plug-in America offers lots of resources to help you as well. So please feel free to visit plugstar.com to find the right vehicle for you, or contact the EV support program with any questions that you might have. And like I said, all these links will be sent to you on the slide deck after the presentation. So here's the list that we've compiled of potentially, and I will highlight potentially eligible vehicles. So this is just a sample list. It's not an exhaustive list. Helps to give us a sense of what types of vehicles will be eligible or not eligible and when. As you can see here, through the rest of 2022, it's likely that the Nissan Leaf, the Mustang Mach-E, both Rivian models, the Lucid Air, Jeep Wrangler plug-in hybrid, and BMW 330e will be still eligible for the current tax credit through the end of the year. We've also compiled a list of potentially eligible vehicles in 2023, so starting next year under the new credit requirements, which you'll have here, of course. The links we provided earlier have more comprehensive and exhaustive lists on this topic as well. And this third column here, likely not eligible, this goes through vehicles that for either the pricing structure or for their final build location, so that final assembly provision will likely not qualify for the new credit in 2023. So like I said, this is the list that you'll have at your disposal. Those links that we provided earlier will have even more information, but one thing that we would definitely note is that you should definitely double check, triple check on any site that's telling you that a vehicle is certainly eligible. Definitely make sure to confirm yourself as well, because these pieces are changing so fast. It's important to make sure that the vehicle you purchase at the time you purchase it is eligible for the credit. So like I said, eligible vehicles are still being confirmed, especially for 2023 and beyond. For a list of potentially eligible vehicles through 2022, please refer to the Department of Energy list. And for a list of potentially eligible vehicles beyond 2022, please refer to this Consumer Reports list on current and upcoming EVs with final assembly in North America. This list from Consumer Reports, I will note, does not include which vehicles will meet the battery components and critical minerals requirements. It only includes current and upcoming EVs with final assembly in North America that fall below the MSRP caps. So now I've finished the prepared part of our presentation, and we're going to open it up to questions. I'll invite Jay Friedland onto the screen in order to help us answer some of the questions that I'm seeing here. And we can just go ahead and get started. Please feel free to use the Zoom Q&A as I'm seeing, and I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing these slides. Okay, Jay, do you want to take a first crack at a question?
Sure. Actually, let me say something first for everyone who's listening, which is, first, we are neither lawyers nor accountants, and so any advice that we provide, really please, particularly relative to filling out your taxes, please talk to your accountant. These are complicated issues. They are especially complicated this year. The IRS has put out some preliminary guidance, but they, really, there's going to be a lot more guidance to see, particularly around the transition period, around binding contracts. I noticed there was a ton of questions about binding contracts, and I got to tell you, the answers around binding contracts, if you read what's coming out of the manufacturers, the first thing they do is they put a disclaimer saying, this should work, but we can't guarantee that it will work. And so I want to just really upfront, we're going to try and answer your questions, but I also want to tell you that this is a absolutely moving target. And to even make it slightly more complicated, there will be a bill at the end of the year during the lame duck session. I don't know what's going to be in it yet, but it will probably provide some corrections and fixes, because particularly around the transition period, this has really, at this moment, there's a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. The good news is we actually have an EV tax credit that goes out to 2032. The bad news is nobody exactly knows how it works for the rest of the year and into 2023 and into 2024. And then it starts becoming much more clear, because the automakers, as Alexia said, are really working hard to try and make sure that they're going to want to meet those requirements, because they're going to want to be able to sell more vehicles. And so that's a good thing. But for all of you, like I see there's a ton of questions. For example, if you bought a vehicle in 2021, none of this applies. If you bought a vehicle in 2022 prior to August 16th, the old rules apply. That's what's going on. If you bought a vehicle or got a vehicle delivered after August 16th, you're in the transitional rules. And if you bought a vehicle, or if you're planning to buy a vehicle, or if you have a vehicle on order that will get delivered in 2023, you are most likely going to be subject to the 2023 rules, other than this very gray area around binding contracts. So with that noted, hopefully I just answered like a quarter of the questions.
I think I'll take a crack at one of these more specific questions, just to give people a sample of what this might look like on the ground. I know that that's mostly what we're all concerned about. So I see this question here about being on the VW ID4 reservation list for almost a year, and you recently got a written contract and signed from the dealer. Will that suffice as a binding contract? It should. But emphasis on should, not will. As Jay just mentioned, the auto manufacturers are being very careful with their language about this, because they cannot guarantee that what they put together will guarantee you a tax credit. What I would suggest is to visit the list from the Department of Energy to see if the ID4 is on that list. I would also cross-reference it with the list from Consumer Reports to understand where its final assembly might be coming from, to see if it might still qualify in 2022.
And I'll just let me just add that to that, Alexia, that VIN decoder that everybody was that you mentioned on the DOE site. that is super important because, for example, if you take delivery of a German ID4, a German produced ID4. So for example, there are still some German ID4s on car lots right now. And if you take delivery of that after August 16th, you probably do not qualify, because as of August 16th, it has to be a North American produced vehicle. If it's a Chattanooga, Tennessee produced ID4, then you should be okay. But even VW has not guaranteed that it has enough it has final assembly in the US. So theoretically that should qualify. But again, you have to be, careful about what you say.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that I'm seeing that it looks a little bit more general is about the amounts for the new EV tax credit. So like I mentioned earlier, there is overall $7,500 available under the new credit, but the new credit is split into two pieces. Each piece is half of that $7,500. So each piece is worth $3,750. So for the battery components piece, $3,750. And for the critical minerals piece, also $3,750. I hope that answers a few of the questions that I've seen in here.
Well, and I think one of them was very specific. And again, I will be very careful about specificity on this one. But for example, the question was, if you get a Tesla in 2023, if you get a Tesla, but it has a Chinese battery in it, a lithium iron phosphate battery in it, will that qualify? And again, the guidance is most likely to be, it would be eligible for half of the credit for the 3,750, because it actually qualifies on the main vehicle, but it doesn't qualify on the battery. And so therefore you have to start taking into account. So once again, you're going to have to go to Tesla and find out, where your vehicle came from and where your vehicle battery came from. These are the kinds of questions that people should not be expected to ask when they're buying cars. But for the moment, that's where we're at.
Yeah. One question I'm seeing here, Jay, is on income limits, and if the income limit will be based on adjusted gross income or just adjusted income or gross income.
Okay, so typically the way the IRS does these, and again, you have to wait for IRS guidance, is it's based on your AGI, on your adjusted gross income. So that's after the obvious set of deductions. Again, please go see your accountant on that. I had one that I wanted to answer because there's a bunch of them in there, which is about MSRP. So yes. The way MSRP is handled is when you look at what's called the Mulroney, which is the form, the basically the thing that says how much your car costs, the disclosure form on the side of the vehicle, it will say MSRP. And each trim level typically has its own MSRP. And then indeed, they add options on top of that, and things like dealer prep and delivery and dealer markup and all those terrible additional fees that you end up with. But the bottom line is there will be a point where it says MSRP of this vehicle, and it's almost always based on a trim level. So they'll be like if you're buying a Ford, there'll be the titanium version, or there'll be the S version or the SE version. All these vehicles have, or an ID4. I think it's the Pro and the Pro S, and those kinds of things. So you can look at your individual vehicle, and there's an MSRP for that vehicle. But I will also tell you that based on some of the manufacturer feedback that I've been hearing, they're urging caution. So you may want to de-option a vehicle, particularly if you're ordering one, so that it doesn't have fancy wheels, and then get the fancy wheels as an aftermarket kind of thing. Those are the kinds of things, because particularly in vehicles that are touching up against that MSRP cap, you want to be very careful about that, because a few $1,000s in options as a trim level could put you over the line. And in many cases, we think that it's only the base trim level that might qualify.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I also wanted to add that I think is our general response to some of the questions that I'm seeing is around application dates for some of the different provisions. So for the rest of 2022, like I mentioned, the only change to the current credit, the credit that we've all been used to, the $7,500, is that the final assembly provision now applies. The rest of the new restrictions and requirements do not take effect until 2023 or later on. So that's something to note, is that the only change to the current credit as of right now is that the final assembly provision applies. We're not sure why this has been designed in this way, but that is the only change.
Yeah. And so, for example, I mean, one big place that impacts is if you purchase, for example, one of the Korean vehicle, Hyundai or a Kia, you'll notice they are not on those lists because they do not have final assembly in the US versus, again, say something like an ID4. If you got if there's a German one, doesn't qualify. If it's a US produced one, it does qualify. And there's a number of vehicles that are, I mean, because vehicles are produced globally. And so there's a number of vehicles that fall in or out just based on their production location. And the other thing, I think Alexei said it very well during the presentation, is that you have to be careful. For example, Tesla and GM, and again, Toyota is going to start the phase out in October, but Tesla and GM do not qualify right now for anything in 2022. And some of their vehicles may qualify in 2023 based on the new rules, likely to qualify.
Yeah, something I will add as well, seeing a question from the chat, or from the Q&A, sorry, is that the credits are only available 1 credit per vehicle. So that's important to note. So that means that if you purchase a Ford Mustang Mach-E, there's only 1 credit that can be granted to that vehicle. I'm not guaranteeing that the Mustang is eligible. It's just an example. But that was a few questions that I saw in the chat. One thing that I will also note from the chat is that there's no retroactive application of the credit, except for the written binding contract loophole, and that window has also closed. So the only way to access the credit is to buy a vehicle in real time that is eligible for the restrictions at that time. There's no retroactive application of any of these restrictions or any of the credits.
Yeah, and I'll even add to that binding contract period of time was literally like a 3-day period or a 4-day period between when the bill literally passed the Senate and everybody figured out, oh my gosh, this is going to cause all kinds of things, because how do you actually purchase a vehicle in the next 4 days? And so the manufacturers and the dealers have proposed this idea. There's some question is, does the deposit have to be 5%? Is, if the deposit's refundable, does that mean that the transaction hasn't actually occurred? The IRS is going to rule on all these things. I would assert that the manufacturers are all going to probably try and get letters from the IRS saying that their way of doing a binding contract was adequate to do it, and we'll have to see. The IRS did get a bunch more money, so we'll see if they actually have enough people to figure out how to implement that. The other question that a number of people have asked, in this area, is if you don't qualify, like for example, if you don't have enough tax liability, can you still claim the $7,500 credit? This has been a question all along. The best answer for that in the old days was to lease the vehicle, because then the car company could take the credit and pass it on to you as a lower lease payment. Now, the challenge is that if you don't have enough tax liability to take the credit, there's really no other pathway in terms of doing that, because it is a tax credit now, and the dealership basically getting it on the bumper won't occur until 2024. So yeah, there's a lot of decisions process in here. If you want an EV tomorrow, then you've got to basically go look at a short list. If you want an EV in 4 months, there's going to be a different set of choices, and you may exceed income caps, or you may exceed Msrp caps. So and different vehicles may have different eligibility. So again, the uncertainty, I would say, over the next 18 months is pretty significant. But then after that, it becomes much more clear. But we're not happy. That's one part that we're not happy with, is the level of uncertainty that was created in the market when the market is really booming and taking off.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll mention, Jay, just since you noted it, is the MSRP caps in terms of criteria for fitting under each of those caps. So as I mentioned, it's $80,000 for SUVs, vans, and pickup trucks. So that would include models like the Ford F-150 Lightning. That's a pickup truck. That would include SUVs like the Bolt EUV. Technically is classified as an SUV. And then for the passenger vehicle side, that's $55,000. That would include vehicles like the Bolt or the Chevy Bolt. So sedan model vehicles, or the Tesla Model E. So that's the distinction between the MSRP cap for the SUV and the pickup truck side and the van side, as well as the passenger vehicles. Another question I'm seeing quite a lot is if your EV costs over $80,000. If the EV costs over $80,000 starting in 2023, it will not be eligible for any piece of the credit. So if it's over the MSRP cap, either 80K on the SUV pickup side or 55K on the smaller vehicle, passenger vehicle side, then it will not be available for any credit. So it's almost a non-starter at that point. And one thing I will note is that the credits cannot be used in order to reduce the MSRP price. So you can't factor in the credit amount to bring that MSRP price down. So it's got to be the MSRP without any credit applied and total price of the vehicle, as far as we're understanding it.
Let me, I've got a couple that I can probably answer fairly quickly. There's a question, actually a couple of questions about 2- and 3-wheelers, an item close to my heart. And I know a bunch of folks are Aptera reservation holders, folks are riding Zeros and Harley Davidsons, et cetera. There is a very active effort going on to try and continue an extension of that tax credit, but it was specifically singled out by Joe Manchin. There's some question as to exactly why, but so that vehicle or that class of vehicles is not going to be currently eligible, but stay tuned because there are folks working on it, particularly manufacturers of those vehicles are working on it. Another question, and again, I hesitate to answer this one a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and sort of try and give you a general feeling. People have been saying, well, what if you have you're on the waiting list, or you want one of the vehicles that is currently credit phased out? And so there's no credit available, say for a Tesla or for a GM. And should you wait? And I think that the simple answer is some vehicles will be eligible in the future. And if your income situation, or if you're on a waiting list and you're hearing, oh, I'm going to get the vehicle in December, I mean, pushing it off to January probably doesn't hurt you at all because it might help you. So, but again, these are, very, 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 transitional rules. That one seems very clear though. If a vehicle has phased out of credits, it's not eligible in 2022. So there's, a pretty strong case to be made for, looking at purchase in 2023 instead.
One thing I'll add, just because I'm seeing a couple questions on the income caps in the chat, is that the income caps apply from 2023 through the lifetime of the credit. So the income caps, as far as we understand, will continue to apply past 2023 through 2032. So like Jay mentioned, if you're a consumer where your income puts you outside the income caps, then maybe it's something that you consider purchasing this year if possible. Of course, there are challenges with acquiring a vehicle that fast right now, but that is a thing to know about the income caps, is that they And all the other restrictions apply throughout the lifetime of the credit.
And it looks like I'm going to try and take a shot at 3 of them right now. So the first one is there's a bunch of questions about the EV charger credit. And so this is actually the part of the bill that covers the EV tax charger credit is actually super complicated when it applies to businesses. They did a gigantic modification was they raised the cap from a $30,000 maximum credit to $100,000. But at the same time they did that, they added in all this depreciable language. So the question is a particular charger being installed at a commercial property depreciable or not? Or is it treated as depreciable property? And if it is, it's a 6% credit. And if it's not, it's a 30% credit. It's quintupled. The other thing, and this is probably most important from a consumer standpoint, they did revive, in essence, so the consumer credit runs through the end of 2022. It's up to $1,000 based on 30%. So if you buy a charger that costs $3,333, if I did my math right, then 30% of that is $1,000. So you get $1,000 tax credit. That tax credit, it looks from the way the language is written in the law, it looks like that will no longer be available unless you live in a particular census tract, which they have not yet announced the collection of census tracts. But typically low-income census tracts are available either through the U.S. Housing and Urban Development, HUD department, or in California, you can look, if you type in, I think it's AB 841, AB 841 tracts, census tracts, and you can find the list of those. We'll try and keep updating this information as we get guidance. We'll try and post things and put them on the website so you can see. But it looks like after January 1st, only low-income census tracts. If you live in one of those census tracts, you'll be eligible for either the commercial or the business or the consumer credit. So again, as Alexia said, you probably want to go buy a charger now. And one of the questions was, well, can you buy a charger now, even if you haven't bought a car? Yes, you can. It's a separate tax credit, so you can do that. The other one that was a very interesting question as I was scrolling through is this idea on a commercial vehicle. So indeed, the commercial vehicle partially harmonizes with 30D, which is the section that we've been talking about with all the critical minerals and everything else. I was actually surprised about this, but again, it was really designed for medium and heavy duty trucks that you could get a $40,000 credit. This is a phenomenal, again, we've been fighting for this for a very long time, but they did allow for passenger vehicles, SUVs, trucks, etc., up to $7,500. So the same credit. And if you read the bill, if you read the law again, it is not subject to the same critical minerals and battery requirements of something like that. Again, I just cannot emphasize this more. I would talk to your accountant about whether or not that you can claim that and when you can claim it, in which year, etc. But as it looks reasonably clear that the critical minerals and battery and other requirements did not apply in that case.
One thing I want to address as well, just because I think it's a big continuity question, is how manufacturers like Tesla and GM will become eligible in 2023. That'll be an automatic change. There will be no kind of introduction of that. That'll be on January 1st, 2023. Tesla and GM and Toyota will all be eligible again because the manufacturer cap will be lifted. That being said, every vehicle produced by those manufacturers now has to meet all of the additional requirements that will also go into effect in 2023. So Tesla will again be eligible for the credit if Tesla produces a vehicle that is eligible under the additional restrictions. So hopefully that can help to answer some of the questions I've seen. I know lots of people are excited about Model 3s and Model Ys being potentially eligible for this credit again, particularly as the more economically friendly vehicles from Tesla. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, is that Tesla will be eligible as a manufacturer, as will GM and Toyota in 2023, but may not have eligible individual vehicles at that point. So it's something that you'll have to check on a vehicle basis. And that's definitely the complicated part of this credit, is that as it was before, all we needed to know is that certain manufacturers were not eligible anymore. And now we need to know which vehicles are eligible at the individual vehicle level. So that's a big difference that I would highlight.
Yeah, down to the VIN. So again, really make sure you check the VIN of the vehicle you're purchasing to make sure that it qualifies against that DOE website.
Yep. Additionally, I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat about what is a dealer. That's a really great question. Really great questions. I have a partial answer for you. So the bill text itself defines a dealer as a person licensed by the state, District of Columbia, Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, or any other territory possession of the US, any Indian tribal government, Alaska Native Corporation, somebody who is licensed to engage in the sale of vehicles. So they have to have that legally authorized license to sell the vehicle to a consumer. So it can't be just, your average cousin or your friend on the street. It's got to be somebody who is licensed to sell the vehicle. Additionally, for the point of purchase option that I talked about earlier, that option will only be available through registered dealers. So dealers will actually have to register their information with the IRS in order to be able to take that credit from you to apply it at point of purchase. That's in order to help protect you, to make sure that you as the consumer is getting what's fully due to you under the credit. So that's just another note on the dealer side of things. As Jay mentioned, the IRS is still definitely developing the guidance for dealers on how the process is going to work. So there are still a lot of unanswered questions on that front in terms of how the point of purchase option will function, how dealers are supposed to actually process that. So there are still a lot of open-ended questions on that front. And as Jay said, we'll be updating what we know in order to share that with you on an ongoing basis. Another thing that I'm seeing quite a lot, I know because it's a hot button issue, is on the signed purchase orders prior to August 16th, 2022. So like we said, if you were able to acquire a written binding contract before August 16th, 2022, so it's not something you can do anymore, but if you were able to acquire a written binding contract with the manufacturer of the vehicle that you've ordered, then you should still be eligible for the tax credit under the old tax credit provisions pre-August 2022 for the $7,500 credit, even if you take delivery of that vehicle in 2023. What we can't guarantee is that written binding contract is going to be upheld by the IRS. So you should be eligible based on the way that they've written it. But as we've mentioned, manufacturers have been very careful to say that this does not guarantee the credit will be applied or received. And we're doing the same. So you should be eligible if you have that under the old credit provisions, but it's not a guarantee.
And I would add, when you go to your accountant, I would print out again, we provided a link to the IRS. The IRS has initial guidance. They're going to be providing additional guidance along the way. I would print out all of that information. I hate to say keep paper copies of things. You can keep PDFs if you want, but I would keep that, because you, in the event of an audit or just proving it to your accountant, all those kinds of things, there is some very specific language where the IRS did talk about binding contracts, but it's nebulous enough that each one, I think, is going to be dealt with in its in its own way. And so and again, the manufacturers are very motivated to make sure that those work. They were really trying to help everybody in that, again, brief period of time. And so they got that IRS guidance. But so you want to make sure you have the IRS guidance available to you. And particularly if it changes, you want to have the initial guidance as well as any modified guidance, because that, again, bolsters your case.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add on the guidance, as I see a question here, and I think it's helpful for the audience, is that the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, directs the IRS, very close acronyms here, directs the IRS to produce guidance on eligible vehicles for 2023 and beyond by the end of this year. That's what it says. What we can expect is that, and hope is that they do it by the end of the year, but it could come a little after that. So I would say, keep your head up for the guidance to come out probably close to the very end of the year or early next year even.
Yeah, and actually, typically with the IRS, I will pretty much almost guarantee you, normally the IRS has a January 31st deadline to produce tax forms of, so January 21st or 31st of 2023, they'll have the completed forms. That's what they're supposed to do for 2022. They usually produce the draft ones in November or December. But this year, again, with all of the changes that happened in the IRA, there's a lot of them. I would not be surprised if that gets delayed, because even with the IRS getting extra money, they are terribly short-staffed. And so, and in this particular part of the IRS, since I deal with them a little bit about this and I ask them questions, they are pretty understaffed. And so I would not be surprised if the guidance coming is slow. Again, I was amazed that they were able to turn around immediate guidance. That is a good sign. But I would imagine we will get multiple bulletins coming out of the IRS. So stay tuned. This is complicated, and again, I would not even be surprised, to sort of brace everybody for this. You might have to file to get the credit for 2022. You might end up filing an amended tax credit because there may not be enough information for them to make determinations, and people may get excluded, or sorry, OEMs may get excluded and then go in and fight the IRS. And if they argue with the IRS and win that case, then you would file an amended return because they will have gotten the credit for you.
Yeah, so very, very complicated. I wish that the situation allowed us to give you more clear answers. We're sharing what we know as we know it. One thing that we do know, and this is a question I'm seeing quite a lot in the chat, and we haven't talked about these too much, is around plug-in hybrids. So plug-in hybrids should still be eligible for the credit in 2023, as long as they have a minimum battery size of 7 kilowatt hours. So as long as that, particular vehicle meets all of the other requirements, that plug-in hybrid should be eligible for the credit. So plug-in hybrids as a category are still allowed. It's just about on the individual vehicle level if they meet those other requirements. So that's something I definitely wanted to note.
Oh, and also for everybody, for 2022, again, in this transitional period, if it is manufactured in the US and it has it still is based on the sliding scale of the battery. So, for example, some vehicles have less than the full 16 kilowatt. One of the great things that they did eliminate is the complexity of what the size of the rebate was for plug-in hybrids, which was based on this complex formula between 4 kilowatt hours and 16 kilowatt hours. That is still in play for 2022 with the US final assembly requirement, or the North American final assembly requirement. But for 2023 and beyond, it's just a minimum of 7 kilowatt hours, and it's eligible for the full potential credit.
Something I'm also seeing in the chat, and a little bit change of direction here, is around leasing vehicles. So the old provisions of the credit did not allow for lease vehicles to receive the credit directly to the consumer. The new version of the credit should allow leased vehicles. So it'd be finance, purchased, or leased vehicles are all eligible under the new restrictions in 2023.
Actually, Alexia, the way it worked in the old credit, because we actually modified a very original credit didn't allow it. The credit that happened, I think, when they modified the bill, I want to say it's 2012, so apologies if it wasn't exactly 2012. But basically, we got them to allow for transferability to finance organizations. So basically, if you were buying a Leaf, you could go to Nissan Consumer Finance, they could take the tax credit and then reduce your lease price. It doesn't go directly to the consumer, but it was transferable in that way. The new credit is actually what they call refundable, which means that that's why they can actually give it to a dealer, and then the dealer can, in essence, take the full credit, and it's not, via a lease. But old vehicles you could lease, and new vehicles you should be able to lease. Again, the individual manufacturers, financing agencies will have to determine how that works. But yeah, you should be able, again, when you lease a vehicle, you should have the credit available to you as a reduction in the lease price. That's good in the old credit. That is good in the new credit for the transitional period, and good in the new credit in the 2023 and beyond.
Yep. Something I'm also seeing quite a lot in the chat is around the income caps and the MSRP caps in terms of changing over time. So as far as we know right now, those caps will not change over time. As far as we know, those caps will remain the same through 2023 and the lifetime of the credit. So in 2027, as of right now, the income caps will be the same as they will be in 2023. And same with the MSRP caps.
Yeah, they're not indexed for inflation. By the way, that is one of bones of contention on a 10-year tax credit, that it's not indexed to inflation. And particularly with inflation being what it is right now. But I would not be surprised if that's a fix that happens at some point along the way, because most of the time these kinds of income caps are indexed to inflation, but sometimes they're not. So, but as of right now, exactly what Alexi said, they are fixed caps for the 10-year duration of the credit.
Yep.
I can answer a quick question on Polestar. So basically, vehicles that haven't shipped yet, that haven't been entered into production, have not, or well, actually, yeah, it's even more complicated than that. But there are a bunch of vehicles that are announced, but not yet available to the public. When they become available to the public, that's when they get evaluated for things like MSRP caps and the like. I think the challenge on the Polestar is it exceeds the MSRP caps at the moment, but if they do manage to ship vehicles in the fourth quarter, as they're saying they will not have met any of their, there'll be no caps on them or anything, so they potentially could be eligible. So if you're a lucky Polestar reservation holder at the moment and the vehicle ships, you should be eligible in this transitional period, because it should qualify both as a US-based, US North American manufactured vehicle and without any of the MSRP or income caps. But it's a very tight window, so they have a big lift to get it done.
Yeah. One thing I'll note, since I know that we're at the top of the hour, is I have at least the next 15 minutes flexible, so I'm happy to keep answering questions for all of you still on the line. But one thing I'll note for those of you who may have to jump off for your next commitments is that we will certainly be sharing the recording of this webinar, as well as all the slides with you afterwards. So you'll have all this information at your disposal. Also, please feel free to contact us at info@pluginamerica.org so that we can answer any specific questions individually. And then just jumping back in here to the question box. I'm seeing a lot of questions still around plug-in hybrids, and I want to make sure that we've given them proper attention, because I know that we didn't talk too much about them in the presentation, but I just want to reiterate that plug-in hybrids should be eligible for the new credit. They're currently eligible, depending on where they were finally assembled. They should be eligible under the current credit, and will be eligible under the new credit as well. That's something I definitely want to note, as we're seeing a lot more plug-in hybrid options available on the market. And one of my personal favorites, the Toyota RAV4 Prime, could be eligible next year or the year after, depending on meeting the other restrictions that will also apply. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, is that plug-in hybrids, we haven't talked about them a lot, but they are still very much a part of the vehicle pool that we're talking about today.
Yeah. I'll also add that I'm noticing there are a bunch of questions about not having enough tax liability to take the $7,500 credit. This has actually been a challenge since the very beginning of the tax credit when it first started out in 2000 and actually 2000. The original version of it was actually under George W. Bush, believe it or not. So in 2007, 2008. The challenge really has been, if you don't have the tax liability, again, your best option is to lease the vehicle. I had never leased a vehicle prior to getting my first EV almost 21 years ago. And it was one of those things where I was like, no. And in the end, they wanted to take my car and crush it. So it was, and I got it. I got to buy it out. But it's one of those things where these days leasing is a very reasonable way to go, and they do in fact, there's a requirement in the original law, which should carry over, that requires the dealer and the manufacturer to disclose how much of that lease how much of the credit you're getting on your lease. So there's a disclosure requirement. So you make sure you get the full 7,500 or whatever's appropriate. If, for example, you have a plug-in hybrid that has a smaller battery. But leasing is a very good option. Take a 3-year lease if you're a senior, or if you don't have the tax liability and you're in good shape. So that's the best way to capture the credit.
Absolutely. One thing that I'm also seeing that I just want to speak to a little bit more generally is around the critical minerals requirement for the tax credit starting in 2023. So as I mentioned, the critical minerals requirement, if vehicles meet this piece of the requirement, they're eligible for half of the overall credit, so $3,750 of the credit. And what that means is, in order to meet this requirement, a minimum percentage of critical minerals must be extracted or processed in the US or our free trade partners, or this percentage of critical minerals can be recycled in North America. So it doesn't have to be new materials. They're actually offering us a little bit of a more sustainable closed cycle option by allowing recycled materials, so materials that have been recycled in North America, to be eligible to meet that required percentage. So that's something that I wanted to know, because that'll apply to all vehicles around eligibility starting in 2023. Something that I will also say is that dealers, while they are going to do their very best to educate themselves, and will certainly be helping in that process, they will not be able to guarantee tax credits. So as you're making your purchasing decisions, if you're at the dealership, if you're communicating with a dealer, they do want you to buy the vehicle, of course, but just be sure that you're making those confirmations on your end to make sure that you have confirmed all the information around eligibility for the vehicle and for your income to get that credit. Dealers are going to be helpful. They're going to want to help you, but they are not the legal say so on the matter. So just as Jay has mentioned, talk to legal experts, make sure that you're doing your own research. Dealers will try to help, but they are not the legal final say.
Yeah, for example, if your accountant doesn't have an EV, bring them with you when you go to the dealership, because you can get them to drive a vehicle at the same time. And that was the best one I had heard lately, is bring your accountant with you to buy a car. But hopefully you don't have to do that. And again, remember that the dealership provisions do not kick in until 2024. We'll learn a lot more about that. There's a lot, again, of ambiguity in this particular part, because dealers are licensed at the state level, or as Alexi mentioned, state, tribal, Commonwealth, in the case of District of Columbia. So they're licensed individually at that level, but the tax credit is going to be happening at the federal level. And so you've got a little bit of competing jurisdictions. And that's why, in essence, what the dealers are going to be required to do is provide a bunch of paperwork to the Treasury Department, to the IRS, to, in essence, get on a list so that they're a validated dealer. And that's going to take a little bit of time, which is why it's not kicking in until 2024. There is also some question. The idea behind that was also to make sure that if you didn't have tax liability, again, the dealer could take it and, in essence, pass it through to you. We have absolutely seen issues around, particularly right now with very constrained supplies of EVs, where dealers are marking up the vehicles by the equivalent of the tax credit or more. And what I would tell you to do is, in many cases, if you order a vehicle in advance, the manufacturers will tell the dealers, who are independent, so they don't have to follow it always, that they can't mark up the vehicle. So that is one way around the dealer markup. But if you go to a lot, for example, and expect to buy an ID4, I know somebody who recently bought an ID4, and people are buying vehicles right now. The markups are very high because the vehicles are in such high demand because of high gas prices and constrained supply, et cetera. But order a vehicle is probably your best bet to deal with that, because the manufacturers really are trying to not have the dealers do markups because it's not good for anyone, particularly the consumer.
Yeah, yep. I'm just scanning through the questions right now, just to see if there's any major pieces that we've missed. I know that there are lots of questions in here, and I appreciate how active you all have been in terms of sharing your queries with us. Of course, we've done our best to try to address as many as possible. We're happy to continue answering some of the more general questions. For the questions around, specific purchasing decisions, things like that, I'd encourage you to use some of the resources that we've suggested, that we've provided in the deck that we'll be sharing around, as well as please feel free to contact Plug-in America. This is exactly what we're here for. So if you have a specific question on a Tesla that you might have coming in, or a Volkswagen ID4, or Kia EV6, whatever it might be, then please let us know. We're happy to respond. Of course, we can't get to all of them now. Jay, do you see anything general that we should be responding to?
Well, actually, one thing I'll just add to what you just said, which I think is really important. If you really, if you have a heart set on a particular vehicle, contact the manufacturer, get an answer, again, in writing about what they're saying. And most of the time they will have some kind of caveat in it. But if you can, and again, particularly if it's a vehicle that's sold through a dealership, then at least you'll have something in hand that will allow you to, say, negotiate with that particular dealer. And again, folks who are dealing with auto manufacturers that don't go through dealerships, then you've got a clearer path, because you'll have a direct answer from the manufacturer. So in either case, I think that's good. I'm just trying to think.
I see one in here that I think
Sure.
would be great to go over. So for the used EV tax credit, I don't see too many questions on this, but there are a couple that I think are important. For the used EV tax credit, the only restrictions around the used EV tax credit are that the vehicle be under $25,000, that the vehicle be at least 2 years old, and that it be sold by a dealer. There are no battery components, no critical minerals, no final assembly caps or requirements instituted for the used EV tax credit. The used EV tax credit is, I think, flexible in its understanding that vehicles that have been on the road have no chance to meet these new requirements. So as a result, the used EV tax credit does not make those requirements a part of receiving the credit. What you need to make sure of is that the vehicle falls under that $25,000 mark, that it's sold by a dealer, that it's at least 2 years old, and then it should be eligible for the used credit. Additionally, on the critical minerals piece, there is a list that we've included in the slide deck that we'll share of critical minerals that they are including their definition of critical minerals. So you can go see that whole list of what is being considered when we say critical minerals. And we'll be sharing that around after as well.
And I did notice a couple of questions about like critical minerals and trading partners and things like that. I think that and the WTO, because it is possible that provisions in the IRA are might be subject to WTO action. This is, again, we're going to see a lot about this. So I think as time goes on, we'll get much more clarity. But The idea here is that you source your nickel from Canada instead of sourcing it from Russia, or you source your batteries from Korea or from the US, ideally, instead of from China. And those are the big targets. And so I think we'll see a lot more clarity over time. There's 20 different trading partners that range everyone from Chile to Korea to Israel. There's a bunch of people on that list right now that we have free trade agreements with. So, and I think you'll see more free trade agreements potentially, which is again crazy considering what has, we've kind of gone anti-global, but that this may actually, for certain parts, may encourage that, and also more domestic manufacturing. So, and there's a lot of incentives in the IRA for EV manufacturing and for other things. I did also note the EV charger credit, there was a comment that I think was very well stated, which was many underserved communities can't necessarily afford to put in chargers. You're gonna, I think, see between utility programs, between, for example, funding in the state of California and many other states, a lot of deployment. Also about $2.5 billion of the original bipartisan infrastructure bill, $5 billion of it's going to corridors, which is called, we love it, the acronym is the NEVI. And we've been commenting on that and working on that to make sure that there's both equity and broad availability for consumers. But there's a whole other 2.5 billion that's going to be going toward communities. And so I think we're going to see a lot of funding that's going to go in addition to this particular set of tax credits. So I think that there's those can be perceived as a win-win. Anything else, Alexia? I notice you're frantically scrolling through the list of questions to see if there's any other ones that we can answer off the top of our heads.
One question that I'm seeing a lot, and I don't know if you know this, it's not actually something I considered, but is around if a consumer can purchase multiple vehicles. So of course the credit is limited to one per vehicle, but if if a consumer could receive tax credits if they buy 2 or 3 EVs, although if that's you, I'm very jealous.
Yeah, again, I don't think we know the answer to that. It's not yet clear, and I've watched this happen with rebate programs across the years, particularly in California, but in a bunch of other places. Typically, if you are married and filing joint, because it's based on your tax return, what they're going to look for is say, oh, did you take that $7,500 credit? Did you take that particular credit? They're not going to let you take it again. Well, if you take it again, you'll get audited and you'll have to give the money back. But it is unclear how, for example, the new credit and the used credit interact. So if you would be eligible based on income caps and MSRP and the like, you might be able to buy a new one and buy a used one because they're different credits. So there is a possibility there. But again, without further IRS guidance, I don't think we know yet. And there's also the possibility that if you're not, if people are filing different tax returns, like if you and your partner file separate tax returns, then each of you theoretically is eligible. But if you're married and filing joint, then that doesn't help you.
Got it. Well, I learned a lot just now as well. So very helpful, very helpful. I don't know if you see any other kind of general themes in here. I'm just kind of scanning this set of questions.
There's a lot of questions about Cybertrucks. I've actually seen like 4 or 5 of them.
True.
I would love to know if somebody tells me the MSRP of a Cybertruck, I'll tell you whether or not it's eligible for a tax credit, and hopefully you can, you're under the income cap so you can afford it. I think we'll have to wait and see. I would not be surprised if Tesla had a Cybertruck configured under 80K. It will count as a truck / SUV, so it will be in that 80K category. So if there's a configuration that works, then, and Tesla builds, does final assembly in the US and does US batteries, you'll get $7,500 if you meet the income caps. So, but if you notice in that sentence, I think there were like 7 ifs. So that's where I would go with that one. We'll wait and see what the MSRP gets announced.
Exactly. One thing that I will say is that based on some of the information I've seen around the Cybertruck is that with certain options and trim levels, it might qualify, given that it likely will have final assembly in North America. And depending on MSRP, it could qualify. So if you're interested in the Cybertruck, then I would just keep an eye on those Tesla announcements, letting us know when the pricing structure is going to be ready. I'm excited to see some of them on the road. Of course, they're very futuristic looking vehicles, so it's going to be exciting to see something so different. But as it relates to the credit, certainly there is a possibility that the Cybertruck will qualify. We're just not certain on the battery components and the critical mineral side if they'll be able to meet that requirement next year.
And by the way, I guess one of the things I will tell you from a consumer standpoint, I would not be surprised if what we end up seeing on cars is you will see each vehicle again has its own Mulroney, it has its own EPA and a federal sticker that's required on it. And already it tells you the fuel economy and it tells you where it classifies. And I think in many cases actually tells you that some of the content, like this vehicle was built in the United States or whatever. You're going to see additional information that will allow you to make decisions. And I think we're going to see the labeling requirements, which were not included in the bill. The vehicle manufacturers, again, the OEMs, are going to really want to communicate that information. So there'll be an interaction. And I think that will start to make those decisions easier because you'll be able to walk up to a car and say, oh, this one's going to qualify for a credit, or this one is not.
Yeah, absolutely. Something I'll also just reiterate is that the credit is available for plug-in electric vehicles as well as fuel cell vehicles. So that'll be fully electric vehicles, so battery electric vehicles, and plug-in hybrid vehicles. Jay, unless I'm egregiously wrong here, hybrid vehicles, like traditional hybrid vehicles, are not eligible for the credit. So
it has to have a plug on it.
Has a plug, it will not be eligible, or it's a fuel cell vehicle, it can be eligible. But regular hybrids are not eligible. So that's something definitely to note. I see a note in here about the Ford Maverick, a truck that I love, very cute pickup truck, very awesome truck. But I don't believe the Maverick will be eligible for the credit. Anything else?
Oh, I see it. There's actually a great question because our folks in state and local government or nonprofits, will they be able to take advantage of the tax credits? Again, the way this has traditionally worked fairly well is go lease the vehicle, and the OEM finance arm can basically make sure that the vehicle captures the tax credit. This is still, I will tell you, it will be a great question when that credit is transferable to the dealer. Theoretically, again, they should be able to take it off the bumper, but those rules again will emerge before 2024, we hope, and be available. That'll happen all post 2024.
One thing I see at the top that I know that we touched on a bit briefly is the WTO and potential infringement on WTO policies. So, of course, we don't have final answers at this point. There are certainly some legitimate looking challenges to the credit from some other countries. So what I would say in terms of WTO objections is it's certainly a possibility that something could change as a result of those objections. Something could change as a result of US domestic internal politics. But one thing to note in general is that, of course, this credit's confusing. The new structure is complicated. One added layer of complication is that it could change. So that's something that we want to be very clear and upfront with all of you, is that these particular challenges that we're seeing through the WTO, as well as potentially some of the domestic changes that we might see made, will mean that the credit is likely to change. It may not, but it is very likely to change. So that's something to keep in mind as you're making your decisions for the next, few days and across the next couple years. In terms of finding available EV information on eligible vehicles, one thing that I'll reiterate and that I'll note here is that unless it's the manufacturer telling you that they have sourced exact materials for that exact vehicle that you're talking about on the timeline that you're looking, then no one's word is 100% correct. So just make sure that you know that going in. Any lists that we're suggesting that you take a look at, those are just for reference. Those are just to help you understand, but they're certainly not the final say on if the vehicle is eligible or not. So that's definitely one thing to note, is that no one should be telling you that they know this for sure.
And again, if they don't have an accountant standing next to them, don't even try.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I hope I'm not offending any accountants that are on the webinar, because you guys are gonna have a lot of work to do on this one.
In general, I think, I mean, I don't see any major themes here that we've missed, Jay, unless you see anything.
Actually, yeah, I see two quick ones. They're kind of in the middle. One was, are the MSRP caps fixed through 2032? We talked about the income caps, but not the MSRP caps. Yes, indeed, the MSRP caps are also, I mean, basically, they put both of those items into the law. I mean, so the law basically says MSRP cap of X and Y in the case of passenger vehicles, sedans, and then SUVs and trucks. But again, I think that's the kind of stuff, I mean, having watched this for many, many years, these are the kinds of issues that get dealt with around the edges in bills that happen at the end of the year, where everyone goes, oh, you know, the price of vehicles went up. In many cases, the price of vehicles, particularly for electric cars, the price of vehicles is going down. So I would not necessarily see the MSRP caps changing nearly as the change in that nearly as likely as changing the income caps over time. And then the other one I saw is Carvana considered a dealer for the purchase of a used EV. That is a really great question. So used dealers are actually licensed differently in most states than new dealers are. And so as far as I know, Carvana is a dealer, a used vehicle dealer in a number of states, but not necessarily in all of them. So this is a little bit like, for those of you who have Teslas, you know, the licensing for Tesla, you can't purchase a Tesla in every state because of dealer licensing laws. So you would, again, have to reach out. And for all of these kinds of issues, I would definitely reach out to the manufacturers, reach out to the preferred dealer, or reach out to somebody like Carvana, or there are a number of organizations like Carvana, who offer used vehicles. But I think you're going to, start seeing, there's already tremendous numbers of used EVs on these various platforms. So I think that's going to be a good market for them.
Yeah, and two other questions I've seen just come in. The first one that I'd like to talk about is the VW ID Buzz. Very exciting vehicle. That's why I had to pull it. Based on our understanding around the pricing of the ID Buzz, my last time I checked, it was around 40K is what we estimate around the price for the ID Buzz. The cost actually shouldn't put it out of eligibility. What will be the larger question is if the ID Buzz will be able to meet the other requirements around battery components and critical mineral sourcing, as well as final assembly. So similarly to the VW ID4, I'd suggest talking to Volkswagen, contacting them specifically to ask them about their production methods for the ID Buzz and specifically for the vehicle that you're looking for. But had to take that question. Another question that I see that's just come in, Jay, I would love if you could try to tackle this one, is if for the credit, if you have to hold the car for a certain number of years, and if you don't, if you would have to pay back the credit. I think that's a really good one for people to know.
Yeah, so this is actually, so the way, so there's no new guidance on this, but the way the credit works is it is to the original purchaser of a new vehicle, and there are no requirements to how long you have to hold the vehicle. So you can take the credit and sell the car. I hope you don't want to do that because cars are kind of hard to get, but depending on your individual circumstances. This is very different, for example, than for like some of the like the California rebate, where you do indeed have to hold the vehicle for, I believe it's 30 months minimum, 3 years or 30 months. There was a little thing where there's a 6-month grace period at the end there, but the idea is that you hold the vehicle for 3 months or for 36 months, and it has to stay in the state of California. So, for example, if you move to another state from California, you do indeed, you are supposed to pay back the rebate that you received from the state of California. Again, different states have different requirements on their rebate or tax credit programs, but at the federal level, it's basically you get it. But again, with the new credit situation, you can only get it once. So it means that you can't really use that to game the system. And so we would encourage not doing that. But again, individual circumstances may apply where you might have to.
One thing that I also want to address just in terms of allowances is that there's one credit per vehicle. And as far as we're understanding, it's one credit of each type. So a vehicle, when it's first produced, might be eligible for the new vehicle credit. And then as it's being sold to the second owner, it could then be eligible for that second owner for the used vehicle credit, as long as it meets all of the other restrictions for both the new credit and the used credit. So they're not counted together, they're counted in each type. So that makes it so that, you as the first purchaser would be able to receive that first credit. And then the second purchaser wouldn't be penalized for being the second purchaser of the vehicle and could then receive the credit on the same vehicle as a used vehicle. So that's something I definitely wanted to know.
Right. However, you can't do that. So the used credit on a particular vehicle can only be claimed once. So
Yes.
it's the next purchaser of the vehicle takes the used credit. By the way, when you do all these tax credits, you submit the VIN for the tax credit. So really important thing to know, you put the VIN down. So by the way, they can, from that VIN, they can tell if it's on the list. The IRS can tell if it's on the list. The IRS can tell whether or not it's already received a credit. So those are the kinds of, that's how the IRS is going to track that. And so that's important for everyone to know. But yeah, the general rule of thumb is if it's a different IRS form, then it's a different tax credit. And so that's, sometimes they do have conflicts between tax credits, but in this case, they don't.
Yep. Yep. Another question that I think is, lost it as y'all are very active, but another question that I think is good to note, and Jay, I know you talked a lot about this a little bit ago, is around the MSRP cap. And if you buy a vehicle that's under the MSRP cap, and then you go do aftermarket add-ons, if that pushes you over the MSRP cap.
No, if you purchase a vehicle, if the invoice for the vehicle says the MSRP of the vehicle is this, and again, my recommendation, just to be clean on these kinds of things, is to make sure, purchase it on a separate invoice. Go buy your aftermarket wheels in a different way, or from the dealer, but buy them, dealers will give you a parts discount afterwards, after the fact, but I would definitely do it that way. But what they're going to look at is there's a line on that form that says the MSRP, the manufacturer's suggested retail price of the vehicle is this. I also noticed somebody asked, well, what if you pay less than the MSRP? If you pay less than the MSRP, you're cutting a great deal right now, and I have more power to you. But I assume in the future, we will go back to a car market where you might be able to save a few $1,000s on a vehicle, knock wood. So if that's true, then it's the credit is still $7,500 or whatever, again, whatever the balance between critical minerals, et cetera, is. But as long as it just has the MSRP on that window sticker has to be less than either 55,000 or 80,000 to qualify. And it's going to be, again, different trim levels, different vehicles. You could definitely have a vehicle that pushed over. So you want to be careful on that and make sure that the way you set it up. And the manufacturers are really good about telling you what the MSRPs are.
One thing that I'm seeing as well, which I think is a pretty wonky, hopefully future technology coming towards us, is if the credit can be used for a solar EV, an EV that runs with solar panels in the top, as long as it's also plugged in and charged. Yes, it definitely can. As long as that EV meets all of the other requirements that we mentioned, yes, that would certainly be eligible. And as I'm sure many of you know, that's best case scenario, right? Running a clean vehicle on clean energy. So certainly would encourage you to look for those as they start to emerge on the market. And definitely those will be the type of vehicles that are eligible for the credit. Of course, caveat, check the individual vehicle at the time you're purchasing.
Maybe we should do one last. So I actually a question just came in. I think it's probably worth answering because people are going to want to know. And then maybe we should, your choice to wrap when we want to wrap. But basically, somebody just asked, they purchased a car in 2016 and got a tax credit. If they buy a new car now, will they get the tax credit again? Yes. The answer to that is the new provisions go in as of the new law. So from now on, you can only purchase one, but they're not going to restrict you from buying another one. So again, if you were an early adopter, you're not penalized by that. And I would, once again, double check with your accountant because, our advice, but the way the law is written, it was specifically one of the things we wanted to do was to make sure that it wasn't penalized. And you have to remember when this bill was written, this bill has been in motion for the last 18 months. Actually, it's been in motion for longer than that, but really the provisions that you saw, but like all those critical mineral stuff and all that stuff came in at the very last minute, and would probably last 3 weeks before the bill actually became law and was passed and like. There was a lot of last minute negotiation, and that's why we're seeing in some ways this sort of market discontinuity and the uncertainty. But in the long run, we will once again have certainty. And I think the OEMs will stand up and be able to deliver a lot of EVs that qualify for the credit.
Yeah. So I know that we're hitting, well over time in a great way. If there are new questions that we're seeing coming in, I think we're happy to continue answering them for a few minutes. If I don't see any in the next like 30 seconds to a minute, then we'll wrap up. What I'd like to say as we potentially leave you is, as we've mentioned, and just want to keep reiterating over and over, is that this information is changing quite a lot. The requirements are complicated, they're new, they are very layered, and it's going to be a big effort to understand them and to help others understand them. So please, as you're making your decisions, make sure you're double checking, triple checking with the manufacturer, with legal experts like your accountant, to make sure that the information that you have is the most accurate that it can be. I would also caution you against anyone who's telling you that things will certainly be eligible, or that you'll certainly get a credit. Definitely watch out for those. No one knows that information for sure. And the manufacturer is going to be the best source of information on where the parts of the vehicle are coming from, where it's being built, and if it may qualify for the credit itself. As we've mentioned, guidance from the IRS will be available hopefully by the end of this year. It could be into next year, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. Which will hopefully provide us more clarity on how this credit processing will work, how dealers are going to be involved, how they'll verify income, all those nitty-gritty questions we will likely get answers on later in the year. What I can offer, questions as they come. So Jay, I don't know if you're reading any of the questions in the chat. Amazing. So I'm happy to talk a little bit to the charging station credit because I know that we didn't get to that too much. So the charging station credit, answering this question back to front, is actually you can get that at any time. You don't have to have a compatible vehicle in order to receive the credit. They're completely separate. The IRS doesn't care if you have a vehicle to charge with your charger. It just cares if that charger fits within the requirements and you as the consumer fit within the requirements of the credit itself. So the charging station credit for individuals is a credit of up to $1,000 or 30% of the purchase price of the equipment to help you offset the cost of a charger in your home. So that's essentially how the credit works. And starting in 2023, there will also be new restrictions on where you have to live in order to receive that credit that are defined by the very complicated census tracts that Jay outlined earlier. But one thing to note is that if you're either, already have a vehicle, or if you're thinking about a vehicle and you're going to buy a accompanying charger for your home, it might be, best practice to buy it now to ensure that you get the credit for it. And then you'll have it ready for whenever your vehicle arrives.
I'm actually going to do one small non-commercial announcement, which is because we're a nonprofit. If we could really use as much help as all of you can provide in terms of supporting our work in this effort. We are really the only organization purely devoted to supporting EV consumers. And so if you feel it in your plans and you get one of those great $7,500 tax credits and can afford to give a little bit of that back to Plug in America, we can go do a lot more good work and hire more incredible people like Alexia doing this very, very important work. So sorry for the commercial plug, but also really, really important because we're doing work that no one else is really doing at this level. So much appreciated.
I think that's a great note to close on. There's nothing better than a marketing plug. But I accompanying Jay's comments, as we've mentioned, I would say it until we're blue in the face. Please feel free to contact us. Our email, and I'll put it into the chat right now. Our email is info@pluginamerica.org. That's an open line of communication. If you visit our website, we have also additional resources for vehicle purchasing, as well as what we call the EV support program, which can help to answer specific questions that you may have around anything related to EVs. It doesn't have to be about the new credits or anything like that. What I will also leave you with is just a reminder that states have a lot of different incentives available. So be sure to keep checking state level incentives. Lots of different states have different consumer incentives available for purchasing that can be added to these potential federal credits, as well as regional and utility incentives. So there are lots of different layers of ways to help support you in your purchasing process. Of course, the federal tax credits are the biggest ones, but don't forget about these very important other pots of money that may be available to you. And that's information that we also provide on our website. So we will be doing our best to continue to sift through this information to make sure that we're providing you the most up-to-date, accurate information we can. We'll continue to update that on our website, host additional sessions like this, and help to get to a place where it's easy to communicate these new changes, and we're talking to consumers about it, and where your understanding is very robust. So thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. You've been incredibly helpful in telling us how we need to communicate and what information you need from us. And we are grateful for the opportunity to speak to you. So hope to see you all soon. Have a fantastic day. Stay cool. I know it's hot out there for most of us, and see you soon. Bye, Jay.
Bye, Alexia. Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.